Welcome everyone to the CPR CSH talk, which we have on last Tuesday of every month. From this month onwards, we're going to try to also have it physically here at CPR. So those of you who are in the habit of showing up to CPR, urbanists who used to show up to CPR on every last Tuesday of the month, assuming that some fun stuff would be happening and that there would be time to speak samosas, gulab jamun, something of the sort. Can go back to that old and very wonderful habit of doing so, and we promise to continue that tradition. May take us a few months to get fully on track, but we promise to make it. So it's my pleasure today to have Nukta work at CPR, and as you all know, this is a collaborative workshop with the CPR collaborating CSH Delhi, which is the French Research Institute working on social sciences and based in Delhi as well. Today it's my pleasure to invite Jyoti, Dalal and Chetan to present their work. It's a little offbeat from the kind of topics that we have. A lot of our presentations have been around housing, right, the city, urban politics, some historical, sort of analyses of cities. So really excited to hear about education practices and the urban order and the margins of the state, which is the topic today. I won't go into detailed introduction of the speakers. It's already with you in your email thread, but Jyoti is an associate professor at the Institute of Home Economics at the University of Delhi, and Chetan is a research scholar activist in Mumbai, and it's really wonderful that they have agreed to come and speak to us today. So I'll hand over to Jyoti. So let me know when you need your presentation.
Yeah, so thanks, Mukta. It's indeed a pleasure to be here at CPR, and we are here to present some of our findings in the world. We can go to the first slide. We will be speaking on educational practices and the urban orders as the margins of the state. This work is coming from our TSF IHS funded project, which is on education margins and city, examining the linkages through an ethnographic exploration. In this particular project, our aim is to examine how education unfolds in the margins of the city. What is the role that education actually plays in navigating the precarious relationship that is there between city and the margins? This research is located in the slum, which is a university and is notified. It's in one of the, like it holds for most of the state-run schools. This particular slum is also located in middle-class areas of the city that is surrounded by government lands around it. There is a wall that separates the slum from the neighborhood middle-class colony of government servants. And on the other side of the slum, we have the main outer entrance, which is the southern slum. The entrance of the slum moves into different streets, which are divided into caste and religion. The slum is marked by the strong strength of the drain that flows right to the middle of it. When you look at the job sector, we find that men work as cleaners, guards, drivers, while women as househelps, cooks, cleaners, and the working parlors, homes, malls. The purpose of our work is to capture education at the margins and education from the margins. So our vantage point becomes the margins over here. To be able to know, whenever we look at education, the suspected side and the understood side always becomes for us school. Over here, it has become margins. Over here, we want to look at the slum. Now, when we look at the slum, how do we capture education over there? We are doing that. We have started a learning center over there, where children ranging from the ages of 3 to 17, they come over there, and we spend like around 4 days in a week with the research staff. And at one time, around 22 students come to us, and we go there with books, bags, and stationery. We help them in some of the academic stuff, and with that, we also help them with drawing, music, storybooks. So we read out stories to them. We go with them. We go with a lot of stories, and we try to capture how is education unfolding over there. And now to examine education, why did we enter into the margins? If the usual site has been education, if the usual site has been a school, so there is a perspectival shift over there. And one of the reasons which comes is because the boundaries between the school and the basti, they are very porous. So the fact that if we think that education is something which is happening only within the boundaries of the school, then that's not really so. There is a constant communication and engagement which is generally understood to the language of SMC or PTM, something which we are also aware of in our usual language as well. But much more than that, the boundaries between school culture and the out of school culture, they become very porous, and that becomes a reason for us to capture, to go to the basic, to be able to see how does education unfold over there. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Is it better now? Okay. Is it better now?
No, no.
Can you support that?
Yeah, is it better now? Is it? Yeah, maybe I'll continue. Yeah. So, before we enter into the margins in the education at margins, let's look at schools and what is happening in the schools. My association with schools in Delhi, it spans more than 2 decades. Largely through my job, where I'm working as a teacher educator in the Delhi University College. As part of my work, interns in final year of their college, they go to the schools where they work as interns and they spend over. So they spend 4 to 6 months in the school, and our role over there becomes the role of supervisory support, where we as teacher educators, we go to the school and we provide them some kind of mentorship. This mentorship also then means it also spills down to the support system that school needs. So we have been engaging in conversations and in our engagement with children in the school, parents, teachers. So that's how the engagement with the schools, it has been, it goes for a longer duration. It took a systematic approach. It took a very systematic approach in my own journey when I did my PhD work, which was an ethnographic study of a station school. So largely the schools in which I have been engaging with, they all are the NCT schools of South Delhi, so state-run primary schools. In all these state-run schools, these state-run schools are located in a middle class colony. And in most of the colonies, we have people who are in the government sector or the other middle class sections of the society. But children who are coming to the school are largely from the margins. So they all are from the nearby slums which are there, and they belong to the informal zones of the city. So they do not have. That's for the echo. Okay, hopefully better. So they belong to the informal zones of the city. They do not enjoy the same rights to the city as against other people. As against children who are coming to these schools, teachers of course belong to the middle class sections of the society or the upper class sections. They have better households, they come from gated societies, and they have access to the formal structures of the city. So this is a very clear demarcation which we can see between the teachers and students when we look at the expansion. Now, schools, so there is this distinction of informalities that and the formal structures of the city. Now, in this engagement that I have had with the schools, there is a certain fabric of the schooling that emerges. And if you have to understand that great schools, they emerge largely at the site of violence, disorder, and chaos. And from there, we started our first project, me, Chetan, we started our first project, which was like 5 years back, where we examined the exploration of violence in the school field. Because we had these narratives of violence and any contradictory and complex picture that actually emerged from there. And we all know, I mean, so a little bit of journalistic work or the academic work, we know the incidents of violence which are constantly reported from schools, and this is very common. And in all these writings, what one can see, what one can see is that teachers are often shown as the perpetrators. And the entire education machinery works towards what needs to be done in the school so that there shouldn't be any violence. Of course, there shouldn't be any violence, but what is the relationship of violence with the school is something that we wanted to do in our work. So if the violence is largely examined in terms of finding the perpetrator and a culpability matrix. Let's find who is the culpable party. Let's pinpoint on the culpable party and then let's try to erase it off. That has been the larger focus. One also knows about right to education, NCPCR, National Council for the Protection of Human Rights, and how it is not allowed, how legally corporal punishment is not allowed in school. In this, the understanding of violence that emerges from NCPCR, RTE, and also the state version of it is the understanding of violence in the physical and non-physical manifestation. So it's not just the corporal punishment that is not allowed in school, but with that also any kind of emotional abuse that can happen. So marking children based on their bodies, on color, on caste, class, religion, gender, all of it is not allowed. This is the overt and the focus part. What does this approach really miss out on and what was our focus? It
Pankaj, there is echo. Zoom participants are hearing an echo. We use our habit all the time. He's not on Zoom. Can someone tell us on the chat? Can you if it is audible now?
In the Zoom.
Okay. No, you don't know, no? We're talking about the Zoom participants.
Yeah.
Better now? Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah. Yeah, so you know, we have these negative perceptions of children that emerge from the school where we say things like, you know, I presume everybody is okay with Hindi. I want to say this in Hindi. अभी सरकार ने हाथ उठाने पे रोक लगा दी है, उससे कुछ फायदा थोड़ी ना है. ये बच्चे तो कंट्रोल में ही नहीं आते, इसलिए तो यहाँ का इतना बुरा हाल है. बिना पिटे ये मान जाए हो भी नहीं सकता. अब ये लोग रूल रेगुलेशन तो निकाल देते हैं, मीनिंग सरकार, पॉलिसी मेकर्स. ग्राउंड रियलिटी क्या है इनको कुछ नहीं पता. मंडोला विच इज अ सूडोनिम है, मंडोला जैसे स्कूल में ये सब नहीं चलता. This is an emotion that is not just coming from the teachers, and so we have used the word official adults, because in schools it's not just teachers, we also have a lot of NGO volunteers, we have non-teaching staff. Almost everybody resonates with this understanding, but more than that, one also finds children saying the same thing. When we have been in the school, when we go to the school as supervisor, as interns, as a researcher, they would come to us with a stick in hand and they would say, please hit him, please hit her, please hit everybody. Otherwise we are not going to listen. Parents also come to the school with this understanding that, you know, you have to hit. So for us, the question then became that how do we send these two things together? Here we have a legal framework and the rights-based framework, which is completely against it. But if there is the legitimacy that violence is getting from the field, then of course there is an inner logic to it. Going by Bourdieu, we have to understand what is it that violence is doing in the space of school. How is it getting legitimate? The fact that it should not be there is okay. The fact that it shouldn't be there, and that's how we want it. But there is a role that it is playing in the field over there. What is the role? So instead of looking at violence as an aberrant spot and trying to erase it off, we ask the question from the different vantage point. Our vantage point changed from there. Now there are two forms of violence. Can you change the slide? There are two forms of the one above it. No, this one. So there are two forms of violence that emerge from the literature. One thing is violence as violation, and this violence as violation, it emerges in the physical and the non-physical manifestation of it. So whenever any body is violated, whenever we pass remarks which are based on color of the child, learning ability of the child, on the caste, class, religion, violence as violation, which is the visible form of it, it's like clearly, easily detectable. If you go to the school, if you sit in the class, you can just see it in the school. But it is other form also which exists, which lies in obey, exists in the command to obey. So if the first category is the visible form, which is directed towards violation of the body and can be recognized as violence, the second one is on another body to obey. Now, when we look at obedience, schools need this obedience to function. Obedience, disciplining, ordering, they all are basic to the functioning of the school. This obedience and disciplining, they become part of the systemic violence of the school. And research has shown how disciplining children, their bodies and selves, it has become the primary goal in schooling of children, which acquires much more importance than educating children in the school. So if you spend one day in the school, you will find that teachers spend much more time in making children sit in the class, and even to make them sit, they will the kind of task that they give. So, simple. So the task that is generally given in station school is that you fill a blackboard with work, and then you tell children to copy. So there is a certain kind of copying culture that has emerged, or telling children to draw beautiful roads, beautiful mountain, keeping them busy in one or the other form of work. So this kind of obedience, this kind of disciplining that emerges from the school, in the state-run schools, it acquires much more importance than taking care of the arithmetic, literacy, or enjoying a poem, or indulging in a story. All of it completely goes to the corners. Now, this systemic, so we are talking about two kinds of violence over here. One becomes the visible, and then we have a systemic violence. Now, this systemic violence shouldn't be seen in opposition to what is visible, which is the explicit form of violence, which is the visible form. Instead, the latter, which is this explicit violence, it is the manifestation of the systemic violence. And over here comes Zizek's classic distinction that he brought between the subjective violence and the objective violence. So subjective violence, where it is visible, where if you enter in the space, you can very clearly see that this is the victim and this is the perpetrator. While objective violence, which is more systemic and symbolic, they both are interwoven with each other. We cannot really, so the categories of what is overt, what is covert, what is explicit, what is implicit will not help us understand how violence really shapes in the school. On the contrary, they both are very much interwoven. Subjective violence, visible form of violence becomes possible exactly because there is already a systemic violence existing over there. Now, this obedience is a very interesting thing that we can see. It's not just that only children are meant to obey. Are meant to obey. So there is a complete culture of bureaucratization that is there. Can you change the slide? So if when we go to the school, the kind of registers that there is a focus on documentation, and teachers are constantly involved over there. Now that the same thing is happening in university also, and we are also facing it now. So if you go to the school, I mean, it's interesting the registers that they have to maintain: Hazri register, attendance, alpahar, midday meal, weekly diary, hobby fund, Vardi fund, uniform fund, books, Naitik Shiksha, moral education register, medical records, the records related to special incentive schemes which government keeps on giving, like Ladli, Chhatra Protsahan Rashi, Girls Fund, Alpsankyak Rashi, Minority Fund. With these records, teachers also have to maintain records related to the accounts and other service details, because I hope we all know that in state-run schools there is no administration. So teachers have to take care of the entire accounts and the administrative work of the school also. Nowadays, from past couple of years, there are constant drives which are happening. So cleanliness drive, World Toilet Day, World Plantation Day, and taking pictures, clicking pictures, making a report, sending them over there. What also emerges, which teachers say, what also emerges, which teachers also talk about, that whether education is, whether we are teaching children in the class or not, that doesn't matter. Nobody comes and asks. Whenever there is any inspection happening in the school, the first thing that they ask is for the registers. Show us the register, show us the documentary proof. So if there is a plantation drive and the pictures don't reach the office by evening, then of course there can be, and orders can be given. COVID clearly emerged as a time where being COVID warrior, the entire nature of the teaching and the teacher's job, all of it completely changed. So we find systemic, so there is a that is called systemic violence. It's not just that only children are subjected to it through obedience, but teachers are also very much part of it because it's already there, and that's why subjective forms of it can be seen. Now, how does state use these different forms of violence in the institution of schooling to govern its margins? When this understanding of violence is taken up, it throws open for us the relationship that city has with margins. So if we have to understand the violence that is happening in the school, we have to look at the relationship that city has with the margins, city holds with the margins, and it is that relationship that percolates in the school. Now, when we look at this violence, it creates a picture of chaos and disorder at the margins on one side. So we see violence, chaos, disorder. And on the other side, what we see is the failure of state. We see that the state is failing. Now, the present body of literature in education finds states to be failing in providing children at the margins with decent education. And so we have journalistic writings and other writings also. But there is another way of looking at this picture of failed state, as pointed out by Veena Das in her entire anthropological explorations, where she looks at where when state is looked at from this order-making lens, then margins automatically become sites of disorder, where state has been unable to impose its order. Instead of this, Das posits that margins become the site where state reveals itself. So if we have to see how state functions, then these are the sites that actually tell us about the fabric of the state. How does modern state govern its population? How does modern state govern its marginal population, to be precise? It is not absent in these spaces. If we think that state is failing, state is absent, it is not absent. On the contrary, it helps us understand how state functions. Thus, schooling at the margins becomes an interesting point to understand how state functions. Schooling at the you have 45 minutes. So the schooling at the margins then become an interesting point to understand how state functions, how state constantly evoke its order-making function to govern its population. And this then demonstrates, instead of absence, state's interest and investment at the site of margins. State is interested and invested in the bodies which are there at the margins, and school becomes one such site. When schooling at the site of margins is examined, now, and we find that if you go to school and you do any kind of research, we find that children are not being hit directly at times. That also happens, but the frequency of it is less. It doesn't mean there is no violence. There are different forms in which hitting is still continuing in the school. With that, even when we don't find the straight caste, class, religious markers in the school, we find new kinds of markers that emerge. One of the markers that emerge very clearly from the site of the school is of the spatial identity. So how they are constantly identified from the spaces from where children are coming. So they are identified on the neighborhood, on the occupational spaces. So, so some of the data that we have where even if the teacher has to just tell them to be silent and listen to me, so she will not tell them, please be silent, listen to me. All the students are addressed en masse. So the entire population is homogenized and seen in one bracket. So so that's the general address. Are Mandola walo, be silent. So whatever is the name of the place, they are being called on that particular name. You have clearly shown that you belong to Mandola. Today you have shown your true colors. This is not your Mandola, this is a school. They are constantly reprimanded on making the school look like either Mandi, where they work, or their neighborhood from where they come. Why are you making noise? You have turned the class into a Mandi. Have some shame. So there was this one occasion where there was a lizard in the class, and there was a mayhem which is expected in a class 4 if a lizard comes. To silence down the children, the teacher yells at them and she says, "Hey, you got scared of a lizard? You eat such fat pigs and goats. You don't get scared of the fat pigs that are found in your homes. Here you are getting scared of a lizard." So when we, of course, in the slums, in the marginal spaces, the presence of animals is very much there. So this presence of animals, how they are constantly identified with the categories and the qualities of animal only whenever they are to be silenced. So in one such episode, boys of the school used to urinate in the open precincts of the school because the toilet was not in the condition. So to stop this particular act, the headmaster told them in the assembly, "I don't want to see any child urinating outside in the space of school. This is a school, not your locality. Don't turn this into your mandi." What emerges over here is a very clear distinction between the space of the school and the space of basti, space of neighborhood. The body of the child becomes a carrier where body from the basti enters the school. What is this anxiety of official adults? They do not want the contaminated, the corrupted, the defiled atmosphere of the basti to enter in the school. And so one can find a constant separation that has to be made. So in all these episodes, the act is not about be silent, be a good child, although one can question all that also on disciplining gaze. However, children are not being silenced, children are not being told not to urinate in open, but they are being told that if you want to urinate, go outside the gate and urinate, it doesn't matter to us. But inside the space of the school, better be cautious of how you act, because that's not the behavior that is expected over here. So when we look at this, so when we understand all these things, we see that garnering obedience or disciplining children, these are not just the sheer acts where we are looking at a population that should be economically productive, politically docile, compliant, and efficient. But more than that, disciplining in the school becomes an important way of disciplining the larger population from where children are coming. So it's not just a disciplining that is happening of certain bodies, certain children who are in the school, but school becomes a space through which children, their families, their milieu, all of it is disciplined. And there is data where children's sexuality of their family and the sexual practices, all of it also comes under the gaze of the school. Schooling becomes a way to reach out and regulate the families from where children come. So teachers often tell children how school should not look like their home, street, and neighborhood, places which are marked through filth, congestion, noise, and chaos. So the neighborhood spaces and occupational spaces have certain form of undesirable identity that should be pushed off. What we find is that the caste, class, religion are anchored on certain spatial demarcations of the city. So even if we don't find the clear caste, clear class, and clear religion, through the space, these categories then emerge. And what one sees, the way city engages with the margins of this, the way city engages with the margins in the usual everyday sense, the bourgeois gaze that is constantly implied, that is constantly deployed, which Paviskar is talking about, where order, hygiene, beauty are used. We find the teachers who come from the middle class background are actually deploying the same bourgeois gaze that is deployed in the city to corner the margins down. In fact, the space of education becomes a site that actually legitimizes it. So hence there is a morality of governance that emerges, not only through the scientific rationality of Foucault, but through certain aesthetic categories. This is something which will be explored by Chetan. Marginal populations, especially children that belong to this marginal identity, are always seen as deformed and incomplete. So their bodies are always seen as some work that is always undergoing. And here it matches with the state also. State is an incomplete project. State is always under completion, and so are these bodies seen. So children are labeled as Sariyal, Ganda, Bhadda, and their bodies are to be always changed and to fit into certain frames, which is never completely attainable, matching with how state is. And there is the spatial identity that emerges from here. The last thing that I will just touch upon over here, what we can see is there is this illegality, abnormality, and aberration that seems to be associated with low-income urban settlements vis-a-vis the city that is passed over to children. If these are the spaces which are the informal spaces of the city, and they do not have the same rights to the city as the other bits, this informal relation transforms into the illegal one. So the way they are seen as, if you look at Gautam Khan's work of PIL and how they are seen as encroachers, how these spaces are seen as, how those bodies are seen as illegal bodies. One can see that when these children enter in the school, this spatial identity also translates into certain kind of spatial illegality, where it's not a very innocent identity that, okay, fine, you come from this particular area. On the contrary, it's a very political identity where there is a problem where you are defiling the sanctified space of the school, and this is something where you shouldn't be there. So there is a spatial illegality which is used in the school through which margins are constantly cornered and these identities are formed. So what we can see is that the site of education translates similar sentiments to children in the school, the same sentiments through which city navigates with the margins. Their bodies are seen as disruptive and disorderly in the school and are at the other end of the good student. If the discourse of the city as well as the legal framework looks at the population of the settlements as encroachers or burden on the state and the city, in school we find a similar pejorative attitude. Seeing children and their families as unscrupulous elements of the city, teachers then pose themselves as guardians and well-wishers of the city. That's how it is our job, and how there is a paternalistic state and how they are the freeloaders. This bourgeois gaze gets activated and they put themselves at the other extreme as honest citizens vis-a-vis the dirty, abominable presence of margins. So I will just finish by talking about this case of Janvi, and this around 3 years back before COVID, she was very interested in kabaddi, and she was a good player of kabaddi and this so-called tomboyish girl in the school. One day she had this fierce battle and there was this fight between schools and she hit another girl. The entire act of violence became so undesirable for the principal that the principal of the school told Janvi not to come to the school. She not just told her not to come, she even denied her a TC. Now, the legible practices of the state works in a manner that if you don't have a TC, you can't get admitted to any other school. There was no reason being given. She was just being told that you are not going to come. Now, the fact that we have a principal who is actually acting like a petty sovereign, there is no rule, there is nothing like that through which you can tell a child not to come to the school. And it's been 4 years, the girl has not been able to go to school. School doesn't let her enter inside the gates. They're not even giving her a TC. We can see that what we find over here is that when law reaches the margins, or in other words, it operates in informalities, the force of law separates itself from the content of the law. And in that case, any decree, something that the government talks about in state of exception, in that case, any decree from any bureaucratic official takes the form of law. So it's not, so the distinction of what is a law and what is not law completely blurs down when we enter in the informal zones of the city. It takes the form of a law, and in that light, and that becomes a ground through which petty sovereigns also emerge. It is this matrix that constructs the affinity between informality and illegality, producing the category of spatial illegality.
And of course, I'll move from school to the basti. One of the things that we need to know, as Jyoti has been talking about, that basti is divided into lanes. You know, basti is not governed through addresses as we think about it. So there will be a couple of lanes of the Dalit population, then there is a lanes for Muslim population, and there's a mixed population in between, what you might call, higher caste or whatever. So say when we look at when we look at children from one of these lanes, do not engage with children from the other lanes. So if you want to sort of work with children in the middle lanes, the children from the Dalit population will not come and mix over here. Similarly, the Muslim population will not mix with the Dalit population, and vice versa. So each population is sort of demarcated. Sometimes some kind of mix happens. So sometimes a Muslim girl, a Muslim boy might come into a learning center, but usually these are pretty demarcated boundaries. If you ask, we asked a woman over there that why don't the children go, why can't we have a collective group? Because each group wants to, access us separately. So her response was, कि लड़ाई हो जाती है. That's the first thing. The other one was more interesting, that about the Muslim corner, that आप समझ लीजिए कि ये इंडिया है, वो पाकिस्तान है. So we need to see that there is a particular way that lanes are structuring the identity of the Basti in some sense. These lanes have a character of commons. So these lanes also blur the distinction between private and public. So if you walk through the lane, you're almost walking to the homes of the people in some sense, because those are visible to you, and that's where the washing and sometimes even toilets are built on the lanes and so on and so forth. In fact, when COVID happened, we don't realize that when government's focus of quarantining was on household units, if you go into any of the bastis, you couldn't quarantine in the house. What you had to do was focus on quarantining in the lane. The unit of quarantine had to be the lane. And of course, that's not something state could see, but the practices evolved from ground up that is how they could that is how they could manage it. And we have a lot of COVID stories, but so think about the Basti is that Basti actually is an intermediary space between the village and the city. And that's something we need to be cognizant of. What I mean by this is that Basti actually inhabits sort of equidistant from the city and the village. In some senses, Basti has to keep some part of the village within itself alive, such that the links back home. That is why when COVID happened, people are walking back to the village, because that's where they see their home as in that sense. And vice versa, Basti also has to connect and create that space from which a certain right to the city remains accessible. And that inside outside distinction collapses when you enter into these spaces. Okay. One of the things that we need to think about is that this tension between the village and the city, which we see in the Basti, is not simply emerging from its social economic conditions. Those are very important part of it. It is also emerging from the nature of desires that is pitching rural to the urban. And we need to focus upon what kinds of aspirations and choices are stitching these two worlds together. And I will expand what I mean by desire in this context in a bit. Okay, and if we look at education and in what role education is playing in the Basti, we immediately see that education actually has this constituent link to this desire to access the city, in some sense. So parents and children both find schooling at a point to which they can find a legitimate entry into the city. That is what so if you talk to parents in the Basti, you would immediately get responses like, "Mera beta शहर में पढ़ता है, मेरा बेटा गांव में पढ़ता है." That's a very important distinction for them, where they have admitted the child. Also, gender plays a very important role in these things. So if there's a girl child, you would want her to be admitted in the village because you don't want her to be corrupted by the city. If it's a male child, you would want him to be admitted in the city. A lot of these kind of distinctions emerge within these contexts. Also, you get other kinds of sort of choices emerging from this of nature, where which school do you send your child? Is it a low-fee private school? Is it a state-run government school? Can you afford a private tuition to your child or not? So there are children who go to NGOs, and they will call them tuition only. And there are children who will go to private tuitions after the school, and then there are children who will not go anywhere. And we don't realize this from the outside, but if you're working in those conditions, these distinctions are very important to children themselves. So if you work with them, they will come and tell you themselves, "ये बच्चा स्कूल नहीं जाता, या ये तो private school में जाता है," या a mother will come up and tell you that मेरा बेटा तो I'm in a private school, Dalal, and it's difficult for us, but we are still doing it, and so on and so forth. These distinctions actually are very much connected to the aspirations they have regarding it. They reflect that in some senses, and how do we think through that? That reality of education within that context. The other thing actually that comes off, and this is there in the literature itself, and if you work in both these spaces, it will be very evident to you. If you work in the school, the reaction of school to the children is that they don't want to study. That's the ground upon which teachers make their claim that that why the school is failing. And there is a failure of the school. If you go and talk to the parents, they will tell you that school mein to padhai nahi hoti. In fact, if you really want to understand today how education is functioning in some sense, you have to go and look at the shadow education matrix. Because it is in shadow education that ideology of education fully reveals itself. The school is a space which is only giving you the legitimacy to the city in some sense. Where you go, you waste your time, you eat your midday meal, and you come back home. And how do we, see this kind of practices? Okay. So teachers would always look at these children don't want to study. They only come to the school for free stuff, and they're burden on the state and so on and so forth. But if you go to the city, and I remember when I went the first time, there used to be a small library started by somebody who studied from the university and got a little well off. So he came back and took a room, and he started a library over there, and he started giving library cards. And so first time I went there, I went to that library. And that library was waiting for 7, 8 children. The minute I walked in, and they did not know me, I did not know them. You walk in, and 7, 8 kids would come and sit immediately. And they were waiting for somebody like me or somebody from IIT or somebody from JNU to walk in and start teaching them. And immediately you can ask, when me and Jyoti started going, I think 6 months back, 7 months back after COVID, I think 7 months. 7 months back, we immediately started getting 15 to 20 kids every day from just from the 2 lanes, because which lane you're working in means so the whole basti might have 20, 300 houses, but each couple of lanes would have say 30, 40 children. So out of the 20 plus number would always come and sit in the learning center. And the learning center is also not something which we have official space for. It's a space next to the community center in that sense. Community center and toilet. So it's in between space that. So you can see how the structure works. And each lane, if you go and sit, each lane children will start coming to you. So we've sat in different lanes. We've not sat in the Muslim one yet, but we've sat in the mixed one and that one both times. So what you see is that there is this great desire for education. That story immediately contradicts itself when you go to the basti. The story that teachers are trying to tell you. The other thing is, that if we look at the other thing is that a lot of children who are not going to the school because of the COVID, but even they are coming to learning center. And there are a lot of children who are actually enrolled in schools in the village. They are stuck in cities. So if you ask them where you go to school, these schools don't go with that, but they want to come and access education over here. So the question is, how do we understand the desire for education in the margins? And the interesting thing is that this desire never translates to concrete educational practice. This desire almost always remains, attached to certain peripheral, or certain objectives which might not completely overlap with the aims of education. I think the best way to put it is. So what does this desire for education constitutes? And this desire primarily, at least in my experience, constitutes 3 things, which is private English medium education, acceptance of education market, and test-intensive culture of education. If you really analyze it, it is through these 3 things that this desire actually manifests itself. So low-income neighborhood has great demand for education, contrary to what teachers tell us in schools. But this great demand easily converges with the market forces and social mobility. and splits away from the ideals of education. And generally, when we look at this contradiction, this splitting away, from the ideals of education, uh, generally the words that we use to explain this contradiction in literature is the word like neoliberalism, or words like global processes, or words like biopolitics, or any of these fancy, that how do we understand this contradiction that on one end you want something, and on the other hand, the way you want it itself contradicts what you want. Isn't it? That's the kind of problem, And one of the problems with ethnography and ethnographic exploration is that it doesn't allow these easy distinctions between global and local processes. When you go and look at something on the ground, that easy distinction between what is global and what is local breaks for you. It's not very easy to simply sit there and think, oh, this is neoliberalism. That kind of an explanation doesn't work for an ethnographer. And then how do we, and if we observe these changes in their, very local matrices, the gravity and pull of these global processes become most clear, not because neatly explained by certain choices being made by the parents, but precisely because these explanations come in the place of a gap or a lack which cannot be easily explained. It's not because you can easily explain a certain local process by giving it a global picture. It's precisely because that global picture actually covers what you cannot understand locally. You let go of that question and you bring in something else from there, and you become satisfied with the explanation you have. So it is, one has to see that relationship between urban processes and city is a very volatile relationship. It's very unpredictable. And especially at the margins, it becomes very, very clear at the margins that these relationships are hinged together by very temporary and precarious threads. And especially in the context of education. Because in education, to be honest, the aspirations of education and what children can achieve from education in concrete terms for the parents themselves, they do not match at all. They do not overlap. Most parents know that their children would have to find alternate jobs in the city. Most children start finding alternate work at a very young age. I remember incidents where at that time I was working in the school. I was researching in the school. A child actually, he's a good child. He's good in maths, he's good in English. Teachers wanted him to come to school, and his father one day fell ill, and he dropped out. He first started taking care. He has a shop in the basti. He started sitting on the shop. So teachers asked him, "When are you coming?" So he said, "We'll just come back. We'll just come back." And finally, one day, teachers approached the father, called him up, and the father said, "Aage jaake yahi to karna hai. What is the point of doing it?" There's a very, and I can give you many such stories where, and this is one such story where the child at least had a shop. You have stories where child starts begging, or child gets lost on the streets because there's still a gap between basti and the streets also. So one has to see how that gap is being navigated. And I don't think we have a good understanding of that till now. But anyway, so a lot of times this relationship is very precarious. A lot of times a child will keep on coming to the school, but on the side will start doing other things. And for all practical purposes, schooling is over.
Should we start?
Wrapping up?
Yeah,
Okay.
sort of, because it's going to be an
Okay.
hour since we started in
Yeah,
a few
I'm so
minutes.
sorry.
No, it's just that attention spans on Zoom can be
Yes,
quite
yes,
bad.
yes, okay.
And we had so many difficult.
5 minutes more?
Yeah,
Yeah. So
just trying to give you a.
yeah. So what I'm trying to get at over here is that when we look at these local and global processes in that sense, what we need to start thinking about is in what ways does the governing or the rule-making capacities of state, and I'm sort of jumping over here, that in what ways the way state needs to govern these practices emerge, and what is the nature of those rules, because it has to function in this very precarious, informal, temporary, threads. We know, in some senses, the answer to this question that Foucault had. So for Foucault, the answer was that this bridging between knowledge and power had to happen through what he called technical rationality, the scientific rationality. Again, jumping a bit from there, we can see when Asher Gertner started doing his work, his argument was and I'll quote him immediately, was that what was being filled between knowledge and power by through certain technical rationalities in Foucault is now filled through aesthetics. So I'm quoting him over here. Rule by aesthetics traces how the production of an aesthetic normativity has replaced maps and statistics as a key instrumentality of rule in contemporary legal. So the map statistics structure there. You see some kind of similar trends happening in education, where education is moving towards more of its own aestheticization. It is functioning through, and I'm not talking about only the category of beauty, hygiene, as Jyoti was talking about. Even if you look at the content of pedagogy, you would find that the pedagogical content now is moving away from even its rote memorization that was happening before, where you have to remember the steps, you have to remember. Now you're moving towards a certain aesthetic push where things have to look a certain way to find the legitimacy in the education. And you can see textbooks moving in that direction. You can see, and that when the writing of certain turn that is taking place is slowly getting aligned with this aesthetic beautification. So the city has to look beautiful. Your content has to look beautiful. That is sufficient for it to find legitimacy in schooling structures. I had something prepared about how do we think through this aesthetic, but I'll just finish upon this, that if you have to think through this aesthetic question, this aesthetic is not a product of a search for beauty or meaning, which is also aesthetic in some sense. This aesthetic turn sort of emerges from a certain following out of all other forms of rationality possible in that space. And how do we think through this following out, where only thing that is left is the appearance of it? And how do we think through this dimension in, that cities are taking and so on? Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Chetan. I think given the mic situation, it might be better if the folks from Zoom sort of type in their questions or request that we take them. I'm going to stop sharing so that, yeah. So I don't see any questions yet, but we'd be happy for you to either put up your hands and we can open the audio option for you, or you can type it in, and we'll wait for a couple of minutes. And if there isn't anything in Zoom, then I'm sure we have questions in the room today. I can see a lot of familiar names in the Zoom today, and I'm surprised they're not asking questions. Okay, there is Partho. Yeah, Partho, why don't you talk and let's see if we can hear you. I'm not so sure how this is going to work.
Yes, can you hear? Is that clear?
Yes. The speakers can hear you, the room not so much, so maybe speak a little louder.
Right. If you can just take on a little bit from the last thing that Chetan was speaking about, which was the aesthetics of education. Does he? I'm a little sort of confused at two levels. One is because education, in some sense, the delivery is driven by this whole process of boards and curriculum, etc. And one of the sort of major initiatives has been this, for example, the happiness curriculum that sort of come in. Now, is that the kind of thing that you are referring to when you're moving in this direction? And how do you then sort of relate that to your other point at right at the beginning, where you spoke about this sort of tendency of segregation, both by religion as well as by caste, but is it therefore, and on that, is it the case that you feel the class aspect is not as major because the student pool which is there in the government schools is sort of more class homogeneous in that sense? And do you see on that any difference pre-COVID, post-COVID, given the kind of changes that have happened? That's the sort of one broad sort of story that's coming. But yes, it was a pity that the first half of the presentation was a little difficult to follow because of the audio issues. Really sorry about that.
Who wants to take that?
So, on the question of yes, happiness curriculum is actually a good example. But I am not only focused upon curriculum, to be honest. I didn't sort of mention it, but if you look at what is happening in the Basti itself, you find that within the Basti, there's an inertia towards finding meaning on, let's say, YouTube channels. Almost every child in the Basti has a YouTube channel that they want to sign you up for. And I had some YouTube videos with me also in my laptop, which I can't show here right now. But all of those videos actually are an amalgamation of a certain form of aggression on one side. Of course, it has use of guns or symbolism of guns and so on and so forth. And on the and a certain form of a certain morphing of this frustration towards what they can access in the city. So this desire for education actually is moving in other directions around us. As per the curriculum, it's not only happiness curriculum is a great example, but this is also happening in subjects like science. This is also happening in when you look at the way your history textbooks are changing or the way your social sciences is changing in schooling. So, for instance, schooling, you find that social sciences is moving towards getting these posters done for World Toilet Day, or a child being made to wash hands 4 times the right photograph, but washing hands doesn't come out for a certain, the curriculum is actually moving in a direction where it doesn't trouble anybody to the extent that its normative structure gets satisfied, but its content gets hollowed out slowly and slowly. And I let's see which direction this kind of a movement would take place. On the question of segregation, sir, I think one can I agree in that sense. One can see that this aestheticization actually is a movement towards a certain kind of acceptance of a certain fragmentation of the public space itself. This aesthetics is a compensation for that. It's a supplementing that you do not enter into really any real politics. It's a replacement of any concrete politics to take place. And how do we think through that relationship between politics and aesthetics? We can start from Walter Benjamin and do down to our times. But essentially, what you're getting into is that if certain difference needs to be negotiated and engaged with, and instead of that engagement, you replace it with certain different aesthetic categories through which the energy can get diffused in that direction. So this helps in maintaining the segregations. And how do we think through that kind of relationship? I think it's coming out very, very clearly. I think on the question of class, I think me and Jyoti were discussing it today morning itself, that it's not that class is not there or the class is getting homogenized. It is that now class is finding its base or its functioning not to, in some senses, only through the Marxist, the working class distinction, bourgeois-proletariat distinction, which sort of happens through alienation of the work with the work and so on and so forth. Rather, it's functioning through different mediums, which we can discuss what those mediums are. But we need to rethink this category of class, right? Something like what Bernard Stiegler is doing in his work, and how do we think through the new ways through which class is operating in our lives. Thank you, sir.
can I just add one other thing that sort of just came up?
Yeah, sure,
Yes.
Partho. I also have
Sure, Sure. So this is sort of links back to this whole issue of both aesthetics and, but more broadly, sort of the issue that Jyoti raised about. I think it is more sharply sort of etched in her description of this student who has been in suspended animation for 4 years without TC kind of story, neither in school nor out of school in some sense. And I'm just wondering two kinds of issues as to when we thought about differentiated citizenship and so on and so forth during our work, the thrust was about access to schooling. But what I think is coming out is that even when you have access, that access itself is differentiated in a particular manner. And that actually might end up reinforcing rather than mitigating the original differentiation, because of the starkness becomes much more evident in some sense, right? And I was just wondering whether this is something that, again, getting back into the class issue, is this because of the social distance between the teachers and the students? And again, are they seeing this both in private and in, I mean, I know you're focused more on the government schools, but do you have a sense of whether or not this also sort of shows up in the sort of private schools, and whether the choice of private schools is in some sense because this distance is less experienced there? That's one possibility. And also whether, again, I'm a little, I might be pushing this too much, but I'm trying to understand whether there has been any material change in the composition because of the quote unquote increase in enrollments post-COVID. Has the mixture become different, and has that somehow affected these? Do you see them affecting these outcomes going forward? Or do you see this these kinds of things being actually more entrenched going forward? I know it's speculative, but I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the point of access is very interesting that you are bringing up over here. And it brings us to the distinction, the further nuance that we have to bring in between membership and belonging. So as part of RTE, yes, everybody is a member today, but it's not the belonging. So do you belong to the city? Do you belong to the education? And over here comes the differential access to the resources which are there. So while providing education, under the semblance of providing education, how the inequalities and the inegalitarian nature of education continues to sustain itself. For long, we educators, we continue to think that just sending them to school and not having a violent culture, and so that the teachers can be penalized or any caste class remark, all of it is there very much. And you visit the school and yet you find violence, you find all these forms emerging. Exactly to find these answers as educators, I mean, at least I found the need to step out of the education in terms of the field as well as in terms of literature, and to find the larger and to find the answers. And some of the answers do come from urban and then how cities function. And then, yes, the belonging and the membership thing, that's one of the Agamban's framework through which I understand. That's one thing. I don't know if I'm able to address that, Partho. About the class thing, it's actually much more complicated. So initially, I also thought it's class because there is a very clear class difference. And in my own research and some of my publications, I have come out with that. But when we see there is a systemic nature, because it's not that teachers are the one who are all powerful. In fact, teachers are extremely powerless in the system. And then you find that violence is emerging through the powerlessness in the system. It's not that they have a sense of responsibility and ownership, teachers are the most powerless one. And if we have to look at meek dictator that, Krishna Kumar talks of, or even something like petty sovereigns, they are nothing, they are just the petty sovereigns. Then one finds answers, some of the answers that comes in the larger bureaucratization of education, where actually it's a rule by nobody. Nobody knows. So that teacher will also give you some arbitrary rule and if you go to the margins, there are so many stories. There is this young girl who doesn't have Aadhaar card. We have RTE. All children can go to school, but no, she can't go to school. You go to the school, and something that I have seen, there are still the kind of documents that school is still asking for. So the legible practices of the state, I found that yes, class is one way, but we have to also further then complicate it, simplify it, and then see how to really understand how does class really manifest itself in different ways through which this particular relationship is navigated. Yeah, please.
Sort of add, sir. I think this question of social difference between teacher and students is extremely interesting, because you're right that in private schools we might not find as harsh a treatment as we find in state-run schools. And I think one of the reasons for that is that there's a particular way that state interacts with its own informalities in some senses, which is different from when you actually engage with the same class difference in a private setup. And how do we think through that relationship? And I think this illegality question, the law question becomes important, and how does state look at margins? All those questions become important, and it is in those ways that class is getting, I think, co-opted by other such categories in some senses. Yeah. About, I think, post-COVID changes, I think last was I think we still to see what changes are actually coming up. I'm not sure what is happening in the school at this point, because we haven't been able to enter the school till now, because we haven't got the access in the same manner as we had before. But certainly what has happened is that and this is I think is something which you all know from newspapers also, that a lot of children are actually dropping out of the formal schooling machinery. That is certainly something that is visible on the ground. And how would those children be brought back into the schooling matrix? And what would happen to the 2 years that have been wasted? Because those 2 years are much more valuable for the person's child staying in the basti than what a private school child who can cover it up through tuitions and so on and so forth. Those 2 years can't be covered for the, and that's something I think we are observing.
Thanks, Chetan. Anyone else on Zoom who wants to come in at this point? I think 2 participants have raised hands. Okay, Gaurav. Okay, Gaurav, I've just permitted talking for you. I'm sorry, we have to go through these funny webinar processes to keep safe. But yeah, Gaurav, over to you.
All right, thanks. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jyoti and Chetan, for wonderful presentation. I'm sorry I could not be there, but I was intrigued by one point which Chetan made about Bhakti being, in some sense, a linking point between village and the city. That it's people constantly in the village but constantly in the city, and we have studied about Basti, like it has always been in the margins, in the sense like whether it's legal, illegal, informal, formal, all these kind of things. So Basti had that kind of understanding for urban researchers for years. I'm just interested for you to explain more that how do you, like, by being part of Basti, how is it that it's a time-based thing that you become urban for certain things, you become rural for certain things, that how is Basti placed between rural and urban? Like in which way, and in which way is it rural, and in which way it is urban? Yeah, thanks.
Gaurav, yeah. So what I meant by that was that busting is rural in particular ways and urban in particular ways. Um, I actually think it stands outside both in some sense, and it includes both in other ways. What I mean by it is if you think through, let's take city rural village binary, so this idea of anonymity. The city allows you certain anonymity from social identities, hierarchies, and rural life is actually more visible in that sense. And if you look at Basti actually has to hold both of these identities together. Within the Bastis, yeah.
Why not any other settlement was only Bastis?
Hmm?
Especially if you're talking about Delhi, why Basti specifically figured out with that? I
But-
think every settlement has to juxtapose this two because
Not-
yes. Mumbai colonies are very amorphous in nature and they have people from all sorts coming from and
Yeah,
every-
and the distinctions
and
between
then
resettlement and
Basti
bastis are also
Basti
blurry.
that- why does the Basti stand out?
Yeah, so the reason that Basti stands out is because for Basti, those rural links, those rural practices have to be sustained in the city also. For instance, I don't know where my village is. I will not go back to it maybe once in 10 years, 7 years, different question. The Basti I work in, the children, adults go back to the village every year, every 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. In fact, now it's not possible, but earlier the children were enrolled in both the schools.
Yeah.
School in the city and the school in the village also. So that they can engage in the practices in both these spaces. This is not something you can find in any other settlement.
So just to interject for the Zoom audience, Chamindro's questions are around why does this rural urban discussion only apply to the Basti in particular and not to other kinds of informal settlements in Delhi? That's what you were trying to ask, right?
Just what separate identity of-
What separate identity does a Basti have?
I mean,
Because they can't hear you, so.
you are referring to circularity to some extent. But he has a mass of people who has very close link back and forth to the society. In other places.
Yes, but it's not just that. It is more than that. It is also that city is not completely open to them. Their access to city is not directly easily in that sense that if they can just simply come and get a house in the city and they can only go back if they want to. That's not their case. They need those links necessarily, which is why it's an in-between space, which is why it's not easy to discern it from, so if you enter the Basti also, you enter into a different space within the city than how you navigate the city markets and so on.
The safety of falling back into the rural is as important
As
to them. That
important to
safety
them.
net is important to them.
Extremely
It is not important to others.
No, there's a necessity built into that structure. So that is, I think, one way to understand that that kind of a question. I think other important thing, as I said, was that even if you think through this question of anonymity, you have to understand that citizenship actually is only one kind of claim to any such space. There are multiple other forms of claims to which, and if you start observing what other claims people have toward the city or to the village, you would understand in a Basti, these both things have to simultaneously exist with each other. So one of the ways to think about it is the Basti, the heterotopia, Foucauldian sense. In that sense that it has to hold multiple different kinds of orders together without those orders necessarily completely collapsing into each other. That's the thing that you have to think through in this context. That there are different orders placed simultaneously with each other. They can be linked to rural, they can be linked to the city, they can be linked to the people they're working in their housing and so on and so forth. And these orders do not necessarily want to engage with one another. They don't simply resolve into each other as a Hegelian dialectic would. They don't synthesize into something other. They remain alongside each other all the time.
So as a follow-up to just what you've said, and the question I wanted to ask before was, there was this very, very rich description of how the school sees the Basti through the children that attend it. And then there's this work that the Basti is performing of holding all these different kind of orders together. And then there's the bureaucracy that the school represents. And as you clearly described, it's almost a powerless bureaucracy that is reproducing very rigid rules in multiple contexts. And this is just one kind of reproduction. The context of the Basti is one kind of reproduction. So the question is, do you see what is happening in terms of violence towards the children, implicit, explicit, all those the different forms of violence, which are actually two sides of the same coin or actually similar. Do you actually see that as a manifestation of a very rigid bureaucracy having to adjust to a context in which it has no way to place itself, whereas the context actually has long experience in placing itself in all these multiple orders? So, are you getting what I'm trying to say? The Basti is playing all these different identities all the time. It's playing these different types of gullies within it and coexisting in these multiple things, whereas the school is this almost like clearly this more monochromatic kind of bureaucracy, which has to reproduce itself in different locations. So is that the problem? That, I mean, what I'm trying to get is that, there were two ways you described it. How the school sees the Basti, and then Chetan went into how the Basti sees the school. And I'm having a hard time in my mind bringing these two descriptions together, which is also could be where your work is right now.
Yeah.
But just to take a shot at trying to do that.
Thanks for articulating it so well.
That's what we are trying to do.
Maybe you can follow, but I just want to say, looking at school as only the bureaucratic rational machinery will also not be the correct picture, because it has gone into the roots and into the interiors of everything. So the way even the water, so there was a wall that got broken. There is a nala that is overflowing. A simple thing of, it's not that for them the question becomes that why is there a nala? All they want is the nala to get clean. It involves bureaucracy. There is a wall that got broken, and because of which there have been there was a case of child abduction and people were feeling unsafe and all. How do you get the wall? It's very interesting when we were going over there. So those people were telling us, we have arguments. Don't worry about the arguments. You just come with us. We will. So I don't know if a wall is broken, to which office to go. And the people they told me, we know the office, we know the official. You just stand with us. Now the fact that here is a body who comes from the city, in the formal zones of the city, who looks educated, who has the right language, and they know that this body will be taken seriously, while theirs will not be. So it's and over here comes the charm of education also, the desire to be educated, something that he was talking about. Everybody thinks they don't want to get educated. And you step in the Basti, the first thing that they see an educated person with a chola is Didi Padha do, Riya Padha do. And people has to understand this desire, and state is constantly playing with this desire. But there is a desire which it took me a lot of my time, it took me a lot of time in my own personal journey to understand that this desire cannot be understood only within the space of education. This desire is connected with how city is treating them. I mean, they want to be taken seriously when they go to the office. Not just that. So these women have been working as maids, and during COVID, so they tell us that, we don't like the way they are treated. So homes where I have been going for 6 years, now the woman is telling us, "Dur se baat karo," putting kapda on the mouth and all that. I'm more concerned about your children and my children. There is a voice of dignity.
Yeah.
They want they're asking for the dignified life. Education becomes one of the ways through which that is possible. I mean, we also wonder, everybody's saying you can't study, and yet they want to study. It's a different matter that what education stands for and the education that they want. One can still argue that if education is for growth, progress, critique, questioning. No, it's a very technical, bureaucratic understanding of education. They want to be in the system of bureaucracy. They want to have the Aadhaar card, have all the papers, so that they can participate as in as much dignified and rightful manner as I am able to, or at least closer to that. So it's not just the school which is the bureaucracy, while there is a larger disorder and the chaos. On the contrary, state is trying to, through its machinery of bureaucracy, is constantly trying to create these orders, and it's never complete. If it completes, what would state do? It has to constantly create these spaces of disorder. You want to add something?
I think it's a great question. I think Jyoti has, sort of stretched it. I would just say one thing, that when we think of the relationship between state and
I want to speak up.
yeah, am I audible? Yeah. So when we think of the relationship between state and what makes something visible to the state in some senses, we think of this failure as a structural failure. So state can't do it. You know, I think your question somewhere has that presupposition that this is monochromatic and that is not, and that is where the failure rests in that sense. But I think the failure, if we really think about it, state is not monochromatic in that sense. State wants this failure to be there. State's anxiety is not its failure. State anxiety is what it can do with that failure. We have to think through that problem in that sense. There's something like Meena also think about it. That state is not anxious about not failing. State is not saying, okay, let me decide how I will succeed. That is not one of the things that state's rationality is all about. State rationality is how do we structure this failure in a certain manner through which certain order can be maintained. So we need to rethink how state is approaching these.
So your parameter of success is order, not educational
not mine.
achievement. I mean, state's parameter.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, and that is where we should say that we should place bureaucracy in that sense.
All right. Very interesting. Aprajita, you had a question?
I just, so when you were talking, I constantly felt like there were two visions at work. There was I would say that instead of saying that there's just the concept of like covering up the failure, or maybe there's not even to cover up the failure. Maybe there is a larger social aspiration at work. So along with aestheticization, if you were to think about William Mazzarella and the thing and performance of aspirations. So the larger sensorium of the state. I'm just pushing you towards aestheticization as a whole, and the dramatics of the state, and place education within it, and the individual like source of performance and education, like beta acha school jayega. Like you constantly refer to education as a form of social aspiration, not just in the middle class way, which is what I'm coming to, like this idea that there is a middle class aspiration to go to. And I was wondering if I mean, in terms of methodology, in terms of the larger vision for your own project, where does the middle class aspiration come in? Do you think it's defunct? It's gone? There is no such, in terms of the state and also at the individual level, the state isn't interested in investing in a middle class or gentrification, however forced and however constructed it is anymore. There's just a ghettoization or a maintenance of a basti along a middle class colony, and that's it. We're over. That's going to continue. Or are we looking at a state where there is disorder, but there's also a gradual accrual change on the process, but that's on the level of the individuals. That's not really a state invested, as more as the individual trying to stake their claim over modernity. So is it really a question, at the end of the day, is it a question of modernization that we are dealing with here? And finally, just a tiny question about gender, which is how are young girls looking at this transition between I don't know, puberty and all these adolescence issues, if you come across such conversations?
Before you answer, there are also two questions on the Q&A. So maybe answer, and then folks who have put their questions into the Q&A will come to both these questions next. I can't see your name because you haven't put in your name, I guess, when you entered the conversation, but we will come to those questions next. Yeah, over to you. Do you want to answer Prajita first? Or
so I think the question about middle class aspirations is a great one, precisely because middle class actually has become the contested ground. So I know if you look at, normally when you look at the bourgeois and proletariat distinction and you try and create a middle through it, the middle actually today, in some senses, the middle through which the other two are actually encapsulated within it. And what do I mean by it? What I mean by it is that earlier what happened was you had a middle class which was moving from this village, city to village. Middle class had its roots in the village, which is what somebody was telling us. Post, I think, 91, 92, you started having a middle class which was uprooted from both the sides in some senses. And middle class actually started changing from these middle class aspirations, not because of its relationship to Basti and so on and so forth. independently of, which is why you can see the authoritarian turn happening in the middle class first. So the first question is not that whether the middle class aspirations are there in the basti or not, whether those middle class aspirations are there within the middle class itself or not today. I think that's the first kind of a question we need to articulate within these terms. Is it only a question of modernity, or are we entering, and that's a theoretical question now, that are we entering into what we might call late capitalism, or are we entering into a point where capital itself is not functioning like it was functioning before, at least post 2008 crisis? And what are those concrete changes happening because of that, and how do we see them on ground? I think those are largely open questions, which we get into it. But we need to think about it, because capital is no longer simply functioning in profit anymore. It's actually functioning in credit, and banks are playing a particular role. And how do we think to wave money functioning into these cases? It's very, very different. Then what?
The way I understand it, Pradita, it's a great question. I need to think more about it, the middle classness and all that, and the relationship that middle class has with state over here. But I think instead of seeing that whether state has taken up the middle class aspirations, I think it's also the other way around, where state has become very successful, and I would connect it with the modernity project also, where state has become very successful in passing on those aspirations, and middle class has actually imbibed that. If state is able to have its order making in the way in which we can see it now, and we can see that not just in schools, we can see that today in university. Nobody talks about search for truth. You go to a university and you say that I have come here for the pursuit of truth. We don't understand that language. Today, the language is of career. And for me, that language is the language of the state, and we cannot look at state without looking at the relationship with market. State comes with the market. So we have the nexus of the state and market, and one can explore more work of Karatani and how this relationship really works out to understand. In a way, state has become very successful, and middle class to me becomes a ground. And yes, those aspirations are then on the ground today, where everybody is aspiring to be. About the girl bit, about the puberty, and if there are changes in that, and all of it.
Did you come across any discussion?
Yeah,
It's okay.
I have to think.
That's okay.
So there are two questions here in the Q&A, and I'll read them out. The first is, what are the teachers and administrators supposed to do with the theorization on spatial markers? How can this theorization be made to work to change the attitudes and behaviors of teachers? That's the first question. And the second is that our curriculum and pedagogy have always been criticized to be based on rote memorization and inane checking of boxes instead of substantial changes. Therefore, aren't there more of continuities in what's happening today? The specifics may have changed, but can we really say that it is now that teachers are more concerned with holding posters than actually teaching? Yes, this is the education, which is why, I think we should really answer their questions. Domain experts' questions. Asaf, you'll have to speak up.
So there's 2 points on it. What is the social location of teachers in these localities? And secondly, is there any form of resistance to these forms of bureaucratization? In the way they want them to be, and are they agents of change, or are they basically otherwise?
Yeah, maybe I'll start from there, because that will build the context also. So spatial location, most of them are from the middle class and upper middle class, largely from the same South Delhi areas, but of course better colonies, gated colonies, and they have access to the formal structure. So we are talking about the teachers are from the upper middle class of South Delhi. So these are with all kinds of resources which are there with them. What was the next thing that you said?
So
Resistance.
Yeah, well, I don't know, because I'm in a university and it's happening to me now. So it's not, I don't know, but do I say it's easy to resist, it's difficult to resist? The way in style inspection and the surveillance it works. Today in university, it doesn't matter about the classes. It doesn't matter, I was just telling my colleagues, when did we last discuss the articles that we read? All we are doing the committee work. And there is a constant committee works, the documentation. And I have no sympathy because when it was happening to school teachers, nobody was there. As educators, as university teachers, we were supposed to at least stand because they are also theory builders, They were also supposed to engage with knowledge, but we never thought school teachers can do that. And now the demon is that devil is at our doors and nobody's there. So it's a larger decay and stagnation of education where it's the middle class, a bureaucratic, completely rational administrative approach that is taking on, which is Bernard Stiegler talks of it in terms of the larger proletarianization that has happened. So proletariat is not just the one who doesn't have money, doesn't have access, the one who can't create knowledge. And today the creation of knowledge is missed across the board today. So there is restlessness, there is anxiety, there is the fact that what is happening, teachers are taking DRS. If you go to school, they don't want to, they're literally counting their months and years. But if I talk of like a collective effort, as a union, as an effort, that why is it happening to us, then no, not really. And there are larger political reasons for that.
You frame up your liberal idea, innovation is promoted. So why don't we see any form of innovation?
But not critical thinking, not questioning.
Can I?
Which builds on excellence, which promotes, which makes them part of this larger market. We have also market. Market wants to expand. So middle class, so what was saying, actually what is happening, there's an expansion of middle class, where they are able to, where they are able to access the market better. That's why there is expansion of, because it promotes capital. So why is not it happening in this? Just to
Yeah.
I think we need to, I'm sort of maybe speculating here, but we need to think through this question of in two ways. One is about question of resistance. So wherever there is power, there will be resistance. Teachers are resisting. Let's not be thinking that they're not. They will be resisting in their own ways. If you go and talk to a teacher, they will tell you what all things they individually do. But I think what you're talking about as the agent of change is not simple resistance. It's, as Jyoti said, it's a question of collective action. And that's a political question that cannot be simply solved through market. That's one thing I think we need to understand, that market cannot replace concrete politics. Market can give you alternate ways of doing things, and those are coming about. For example, privatization is happening, and you would find that with time, through this movement of private capital, alternate ways of doing things will emerge, which are already emerging, and that is why if you go and talk to parents on the ground, they know they have to send a child to a private school. उन्हें पता है कि गवर्नमेंट स्कूल में पढ़ाई नहीं होगी, and that logic of theirs is coming from what they see as a situation at that moment. But are we thinking that there are concrete forms of political organization possible through which we can respond to this? That's, I think, I don't think that politics actually have that space on the ground at this point in time. Politics is shaping in different ways. It's not all gloomy. Politics is shaping in different ways in the Basti, as we said, with the walls, with their access, with their struggle for, and the Basti we are working in can be demolished in the next 3 years. There's a notification coming to it because the flats around it are government flats. So once they get demolished, the Basti will also get demolished. So they are very sure of that. So they are fighting those kind of struggles. And in those struggles, there's a lot of collective action taking place. But
do you want to answer the education questions? Because people
So,
are waiting.
When teachers and administrators and about the spatial markers and how can we make them more aware? I think in education we already know this, in the sense that we go to the field, we find these markers, we find caste, class, religion, and then this again adds to the list, gender, language, ethnicity, and now we add on. And then, as we all know, I'm sure you also know that, so CPCR comes out with the guidelines that you can't give all these markers, and there is a list, and you add one more to the list. Interestingly, since there is a systemic violence which is there, it will take some shape. It will take some form unless and until we really address it. We address it at the level of the larger culture and the ethos which is there. One of the ways, and I'm sure you also pretty well aware of, and I'm in a teacher education institute, how can attitude be changed? I mean, we have to work with the assumptions of teacher educators, teachers, We have to, because of course, the assumptions with which we are entering into the space of the school, that's the space where certain kind of work is required. You want to add something to that?
There was a question
rote
on,
memorization.
yeah, rote memorization and, isn't that a continuity, what is happening now? Can we say that teachers are more concerned with holding posters than actual teaching? I mean, isn't that just a continuity of what was happening before?
I think on one
Your
level,
it comes back to your aesthetization.
on one level there is a continuity, but on the other level there is a break also. When you were talking about rote memorization, you were still dealing with, as you said, certain technical rationalities, certain ways of doing things through which this power and knowledge structure can be stitched. When you bring in aesthetics, and I don't have a space to develop it, but if you look at how Kant thought through aesthetics, so this question was that aesthetics is something that you bring to the object, where subject becomes more important and object goes into the background, and I'm really diluting it right now for various reasons, but you should not do Kant like this. But where object becomes, where the object comes into the foreground and subject goes in the background, you get what you call logical validity in Kantian critique of judgment in that sense. So if you think about it, both of these things simultaneously work. You're not getting an aesthetics which is coming from and better understanding of the object, where subject becomes more conscious of the categories he's bringing to the object. What you're getting is a certain hollowness of the object itself, where you're vacuuming out the object. And what is left are the aesthetic categories. They're the last things that are left over there in that sense. They are the residue.
You're like holding boxes.
Yeah, there is a residue of where nothing else works, but has to work with aesthetics. So it is in that sense there is a constitutive break, and this break is going to have consequences. And I think Gertner's work there needs to be looked at very seriously in our times.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think that would be the last question, and then we can just. No, this is all in the box. Speak up, please. I think our Zoom audience will have to.
Yeah, so I'm going to try and draw it back to the agenda. Thinking about what Gaurav and were asking, this distinction of how the Bhakti as a marginal child territorially distant from other, say, informal or less formal spaces in Delhi. That's as what I say loud. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, when you were talking about the way these practices and the spatial identity is constituted, and you were talking about dignity, I'm wondering if the rest of the non-Basti parts of Delhi are they able to access some of that dignity through forms of ownership like property? Like, is there a heuristic which is operating that allows one's belongingness to be supplemented through other forms, and precisely because that Basti in 3 years will go with the redevelopment of the government colonies? Is it the precarity somewhere? So I'm also trying to think through how the education and the city are coming together here in a way where certain dynamics of negotiating city rural life in the city are not available, like you were saying, but at the same time are also being hollowed out. So if there was some claim of property or some, and this is what partly Gertner is doing with his work, where he's or at least he was doing with his work, where he was trying to point out how aesthetization became one of the means of hollowing out whatever forms of ownership and belonging could have remained. So then how would we see education become the fulcrum through which, because aspirations and futurity in some senses, the very idea that one day I will belong to the city because I'm educated, because I'm so, and that for me becomes the connection between the question of class, because a lot of property ownership, not just ownership of a house, ownership of a car becomes another form of furthering. So it's all forms of property making practices of both the state and those who are affected. So I'm just wondering, how would one see this negotiation play out? Like, where do you see the space for education to become? Like, can education be one of those belonging markers? Like, is education enough? Maybe I'll stop it.
I think it's a great question. Essentially, the question you're asking for, asking around is a question of time also, to be honest with you, and we can get into those discussions. But see, can education actually create the structure for belonging? At this point of time, I think when you ask the question in that form, that can education, we can get into hypotheticals, which may not be the best way to think through that question. But the question, I think, underlying it is that what role is education concretely playing? And concretely, education actually plays both the sides. It is not a simple one-sided answer. On the one side, that yes, education does give you access to the city. There's no denying that reality. On the other side, education does maintain certain kind of segregation and boundaries also. It doesn't need to be either or in that sense. It is both, and which is why you can find some hope in education also, in that sense. On the question of what you're asking about temporariness, I think that's a question of time. That how do we place ourselves in a certain place that we're inhabiting, vis-a-vis the time space that we're thinking about it. So, for instance, if I want, and that is where consumption becomes extremely important question in social, when you talk about ownership, that how do you consume something? And that's so when you know that you have only a temporary relationship with something, your negotiation with that space changes drastically if you have a more long-term view with something. It can be, and I think Freud saw it in his Dead Drive, when the question was extracting the pleasure immediately or getting long-term pleasure in the Freudian, Lacanian, when which later Zizek uses to think through this question of consumption and so on and so forth. So I think one of the things that we need to think about property is that property does give you certain long-term access to a space. We don't mind that reality. That you're not trying to, with certain relationship with property, even water and electricity, for example, they give you certain access to arranging your desires in a manner that you do not want to consume something immediately. On one side. On the other side, the very fact of ownership, very category of ownership allows certain people to always remain outside those permanent, and that's the difficult problem to think about. That how do we think through this, very, very contested space? And I don't think I have good answers to it, but I think that's the kind of question we're trying to think here.
I just want to add one bit, because what you said initially was very interesting, that the dignity bit, aren't we all experiencing it? And I think, yes, and going by Veena Das and what we are trying to do by using that frame, it makes it visible. It tells us how state functions. What is happening at the margins is actually tells us how state functions. And we have a very clear change in the way power is functioning. So if earlier sovereign would kill or would allow you to live, today we have a sovereign which is working on the matrix of disposability. Now the disposability index can change, but it lets you die. It will not kill. And the way it will let you die changes, can then be mapped on different things. And over there comes the dignity also, which I feel I agree with you, most of us experience. But yeah, margins become the space where it gets activated.
Thank you so much. And I don't think we have any more questions. It's been a bit of a trying session with all the technical difficulties, but somehow, and thank you so much for cooperating to both our speakers, we seem to have managed to stitch together a discussion which was both rich and was multi-directional at the same time. And I'm sure we'll keep talking about this, offline as well. So thank you very much, everyone on Zoom who attended, as well as everyone in the room today. And we look forward to bringing you the next workshop in August. Thank you.